Hello and welcome to this special episode of Chain Reaction. I'm Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. My thanks to Aaron Stein and the listeners of Chain Reaction for this opportunity. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll take an in-depth look at climate change. It's been a topic of intense debate for decades among environmentalists and has now moved front and center as a massive concern for national security experts as well. In late January, President Biden signed an executive order to put the climate crisis at the center of U.S. foreign policy and national security. Climate change is an unavoidable problem for everyone, but it won't affect every country in the same way. Some will see mass catastrophe, economic destruction. Others will change incrementally, and in some ways will have new opportunities arise. Today, we're joined by John Conger. John is the Senior Advisor to the Council on Strategic Risk and Senior U.S. Advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. John, what got you into climate? When did you become concerned about it, and why?
So when I was working in the Department of Defense, I had responsibility for the portfolio for installations and environment and energy policy. At first, it was just on DoD bases, but then more broadly. But in that context, I was also the DoD's climate guy. And I would be the one who was responsible for joining interagency meetings on climate change and representing the DoD view and in making sure that we were tracking with administration goals at the Department of Defense on climate change and so on and so forth, helping to work the strategies on the issue. So in that context, it was almost like it was thrust upon me rather than I came to it separately.
So I find it fascinating, John, in the Department of Defense space, I'm assuming you were one of the first ones kind of working on that. Is that correct in terms of the climate issue?
The climate issue is broad and has a lot of tentacles. And I would say that there were people looking at climate change well before the Obama administration, well before I got there. And they would look on it in different contexts. There was the intelligence context. There was the driver of instability context. A lot of folks in combatant commands were watching what it would do to countries in their area of responsibility. But it was also an issue with sea level rise. Norfolk Naval Station got brought up a lot in that context.
Right.
But, extreme weather, droughts, wildfires, all of those issues affect infrastructure, and DoD has a lot of infrastructure.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating that, at least in the outside public, sometimes I think the Department of Defense is kind of knuckle draggers and are slow to move to issues. But then I like to remind them that it was DARPA that essentially invented the internet. So we're oftentimes in the Department of Defense on the front line of those things and different issues. I have to say, it was probably 2 decades ago that I heard about climate change really for the first time, started thinking about it, and it was in DoD circles. So how has that conversation changed since you started doing this many years ago to now? Does it feel noticeably different from your perspective?
I think it feels different, but not all of the difference is within the Department of Defense. I would say that more of the difference is in the political sphere. And so while the intelligence community has been looking at this for a long time, and folks who are worried about stability around the world have been looking at this for a long time, and we've been setting energy goals for a long time and efficiency goals, the folks in Congress have found it polarizing, the whole issue of climate change. So we were sort of stuck in the middle. And as time has gone on, one of the things that is the biggest change that I would observe is that people stopped arguing about the science of climate change on Capitol Hill. They really don't debate whether climate change is real anymore. They have conversations about what to do about it, and those are very animated debates. But this nexus where climate change affects the military and affects national security is not really contentious. I think you find more bipartisan progress in this space than a lot of other locations, and that has come over time in Congress, but is certainly evident today.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. A couple of your articles I was reading, you mentioned the damage to Air Force bases just due to weather, which must be catastrophic. And am I correct that General Milley sort of couched it as the greater loss to what could be climate change related impacts than we would have impacts on the battlefield? Am I characterizing that correctly?
We've taken more damage from extreme weather in recent years at our installations than we have taken damage from an enemy at our installations in recent years. And so when Tyndall Air Force Base gets leveled by Hurricane Michael, imposing $5 billion of damage, that's one example of damage of cost. And when Congress has to start writing $5 billion checks, they start to pay attention. But there have been hurricanes certainly for a long time, but you're finding that they are stronger and bigger than they were in the past. And that's natural to assume that flows from climate change. When you have warmer oceans and a warmer globe, you're going to have storms with more energy.
I kind of want to move into the threat discussion. Sure. John, climate change has become the new threat du jour in the DC circles. And you have a great quote in this article at Defense One on, is climate change America's greatest security threat? And you say, ultimately, it's a false comparison. The real question isn't whether climate change is a bigger or smaller national security threat than Russia or China. It's how climate change amplifies the threats that the United States faces. When you say amplifies the threats, which threats are more amplified, which are maybe less? How do you frame it as climate change in a national security context?
I would look at it this way. If we are thinking about Russia or China as adversaries, then climate change is changing the chessboard. It's the different terrain upon which you operate, and from a strategic perspective, what's changing around the globe. So when the Arctic ice melts, you have a whole new ocean to patrol, and that changes the dynamics. There are going to be parts of the world that are going to be newly uninhabitable over time, and people who live there are going to move someplace else, generally to places where people already live, and that changes the dynamics. Russian behavior is without question affected by climate change. They are moving forces north. They are looking to project power over the Arctic. It is without question affecting Chinese behavior. They see a future where it's going to be hard to provide food and water for 1.5 billion people. And they are looking to figure out in the long term how they set up to continue to do so. I think that as you think about how the environment is shaped, that affects how everybody makes decisions. You have to integrate climate change along with a whole host of other things into your analysis of the decisions that, say, the Chinese leaders are making. So in a way, it's conjunction dysfunction. Everybody wants it to be an or, but it's really an and.
I kind of want to dive a little deeper into some of that. So as you say, it's through its exasperation of existing tensions or existing issues. And one of the ones you mentioned in there was kind of migration, just that people will move to places where other people are residing out of that sense. And I don't have great perspective on it, but I've heard of it in the context of the Syrian conflict was partly driven by climate. Same with the Arab Spring. It was kind of rumored more than a decade ago that part of the reason you had this sort of tension between sort of populist uprising and authoritarian dictators was related to climate. Do you see it that way, or do you understand it that way?
So let's unpack Syria for a second, because you had inside Syria hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Iraq War already. And then you impose upon the country, which already has like internal goals to be self-sustaining on agriculture. So they have large agricultural sector, and a record multi-year drought basically renders all that farmland fallow. And that forces hundreds of thousands of people in the agricultural industry to abandon their farms and move to cities, along with all of those other people from Iraq. So what you have is internal migration driving internal crises, which created the conditions for the Civil War. Now, did it cause it? No, it had lots of causes, but it's part of the math. It's part of the calculus that you have to make in order to understand it. And so as you look around the world and you look at the stresses that climate change is going to impose on different countries, it's going to change their decision-making process in some, and in some places, it will render the governments unable to perform basic functions. Because if they're already having a hard time with basic government services, and you impose something that is just really difficult to manage on top of all of that, then things start to fall apart. And in an extreme case, you get conflict. And in extreme cases, you get instability. It doesn't always end there, but it pushes you in that direction.
John, are there ripple zones or areas in particular where, this sort of climate just the altering of the climate is going to exacerbate tensions between other countries that have spillover effects for the U.S. and the West. Which ones concern you the most, just in terms of these conflicts accelerated between other nations or creating dynamics of conflict?
If you're looking for the places where human security is the most endangered, there's a swath across the equator, around the world, frankly. I mean, you can start in Northern Africa and the Middle East and, look at what's happening there with some of the extreme temperatures and the tensions over the Sahel. But then you go India and Pakistan. India controls all of Pakistan's fresh water, and Pakistan's already one of the most water-stressed nations in the world. But similarly, China controls a lot of India's fresh water. And so the control of rivers, which has generally been something that has been used for agreement and peace, could be a source of future tension. And when you're looking at nuclear nations increasing tension over basic life support, then that's a really big concern. Then you go to the Pacific, where you've got island nations that are concerned existentially about sea level rise. And the first thing isn't going to be that they're underwater. The first thing that you're going to notice is that the agriculture is going to have problems and that seawater is going to get into the aquifers of various places, and that's going to take away the drinking water, rendering the island uninhabitable. Then you come to Central America. And as you look at Central America, there have been serious drought and storm-driven displacement and impacts on agricultural sectors, which have led to internal violence, which then lead to migration. And so you can tour around the equator and see problems everywhere that are just sort of, bubbling over as a consequence of climate.
So we've talked about those that'll be the most stressed, but who stands to kind of win or gain in certain ways, either economically or in terms of security from this? Who are the sort of winners in a bizarre way from a climate change?
I don't know. I don't think there are any winners. I mean, frankly, when you look at these sort of macro changes to societal equilibrium, the winner is instability. Climate change is sort of tipping us off our balance point. That instability is going to affect those places that are in the most affected regions, but they're going to affect the Arctic too. I don't think Russia stands to be a winner here. I mean, it's a complex story. Will there be more open agricultural areas? Maybe. But there's also going to be a lot of permafrost thaw, and Russian infrastructure is not exactly built to like really great code, right? So you're going to have buildings falling down and having to make significant investments, and they don't have a ton of money. And so you're going to have impacts there that are sort of positive and negative. But what fundamentally the commonality is change. And they're going to have to figure out how to live in this new world too.
So Russia is fascinating. As you said, they're mobilizing and preparing for it, maybe more than they're trying to even counter it or disrupt the changes of climate. And it's interesting, just going back to the Cold War, when I was learning about the military, we were talking about an Atlantic and a Pacific Navy. From a national security perspective, are we talking about the U.S. or the West having to build a Navy for the Arctic? And what would that be like? Was it something that we've really thought through as this is occurring? It seems like Russia has, and they are at least accepting that there's going to be climate change. But how is it going to impact us from what we call hard national security and things we need to think about?
I think we need to start thinking about it. And if your focus is on those parts of the world where great powers interact, then you're going to be looking at the Arctic. Because you've got Russia and China and the United States all sort of interacting in that space. And the U.S. could choose to say, oh, it's not worth our time. It's not worth our effort. We're going to cede that area. But that doesn't make a lot of sense from a U.S. national interest perspective. And so I think that means that you have to think through, what are my requirements in the region? How fast do they come? Because it's not like the entire Arctic is going to be ice-free tomorrow. But you need to be able to operate in the region just the same. So what does that mean as far as requirements on your fleet? Do you need more? Do you need different? Are your systems hardened enough to be able to operate in sub-freezing temperatures? And then you have to ask yourself, do I have domain awareness in this area? Because comms goes bad over the Arctic, over the poles. And situational awareness is more difficult because we just have fewer polar satellites. You have to work through the answers to these questions. And those are serious questions.
So, John, I kind of want to close up by talking about you personally. How has your knowledge of the climate change situation and what you do at work every day changed how your own life is conducted? Based on what you've learned, are you changing things in your own life or just considering climate change?
The simplest example is I vacation at a lake up north rather than a beach down south, right? It drives, those kinds of choices. Where do you want to live? Where do you want to vacation? What areas do you stay away from? I don't know that I would trust like a beach house at this point in time. I would not invest in one. And I think that goes back to, for me, it is less about the individual carbon footprint and more about the individual adaptation. And when we think about the security challenge, we could go globally to zero emissions tomorrow and we would still have 20 or 30 years of terrible things happen based on what we've already emitted. And the adaptation challenge is huge. And it is something we're going to have to wrestle with no matter how much good behavior we exhibit in other areas. I would say for me personally, I think more about adapting to the coming conditions and focusing there.
That was John Conger, Senior Advisor to the Council on Strategic Risk and Senior U.S. Advisor to the International Military Council on Climate Security. In our next episode in the special Chain Reaction series on climate change and security, I'll talk to Dr. Jola Ajibade, an assistant professor of geography at Portland State University, about climate change adaptation and coming human migrations as a result of our warming planet. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Curzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.